So what she didn't tell you is that we're going to follow a rocket scientist with an instrument and come way back down to earth. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about speed, OODA loops, pipelines. I'm really going to focus on why all of you are so important in building this really vibrant, rich ecosystem of ideas and problems that drive innovation. And I'm going to start with a very personal story. 15 years ago this morning, I was winding up a night attack in the city of Fallujah, Iraq. And it was right as the sun was just peeking up, and after about 8 hours under night vision devices, we'd reached the point where we were commingled and having a hard time seeing, and things were washing out. And we slowed down in the middle of the city and started to pull those devices off so we could see what we were doing. And literally in the time that it took me to pull my helmet off, pull the device off and put it back in its bag and a holder in the turret, I looked back up and I saw the first rifle-propelled grenade flash across the front of my vehicle. And in a nanosecond, the technological advance that we'd had that got us through the night vanished. And we gave up the fight to 30 folks who were buried in holes, who had spent their nights waiting for somebody like us to show up. An hour and a half and 40 some odd rifle-propelled grenades later, we eventually extracted us from this ambush and spent the next 2 days in probably the most hellish fight somebody has spent in an urban environment in a long time. Flash forward 6 years. I'm now the brand new director of the Army's Rapid Equipping Force, which is essentially the Army's Skunk Works. I've got a $150 million budget. I got 120 some odd people spread all over the world. And I'm back in Afghanistan for the first time in probably 6 years. And my job at the time was to go find problems, take technology, rapidly put it together, and get it out to the battlefield. The example I'm going to show you is what happens when we have the same problem that I had 5 years before in one attack, what happens when it scales, and what the impact is on us when the speed gets out of the way. I've been a John Boyd fan since I was a lieutenant in the Army. And I'm going to talk about the impact of Boyd's OODA loop and how this looks when you put two protagonists on the battlefield. So here we are in Afghanistan, maybe. There we go. 2011, we were just coming out of Iraq. We were shifting weight to Afghanistan. The Army was in the process of spending about $1.5 billion buying multi-purpose ambush-resistant protected vehicles. These big road-worthy things that were designed to help protect our large convoys from moving back and forth from attacks against improvised explosive devices. And they were spending $1 billion on that. I was probably spending another 50 or 60 million trying to find things that would help them spot buried IEDs and other things. The only problem was that same year, the President of the United States decided to deploy another 20,000 light infantrymen to Afghanistan. They didn't use vehicles, they walked. So we have a program delivering vehicles, and we have a force that changed the way it's doing the operations, and they're actually walking down goat trails. And the only people that recognized that change were the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And real quick, the tide of the battle changed. They quit attacking big vehicles, and they went after these young men and women out on the trails. I got to show you a couple of charts, and really what the point to make out is these gray bars represent the number of times a dismounted patrol was attacked by an improvised explosive device. And starting all the way back on the far end, you can see in about January of 2010, it was 1 or 2 a month. And you see rapidly it builds to about 900 by about the middle of 2011. The important part is you see these peaks and valleys. And when we first looked at the data, what we realized was happening was we were fooling ourselves into thinking that we'd see an attack happen, and we'd come up with a new system when we'd put it on the battlefield, and we'd celebrate the fact that we got it right, and we would scale it across the battlefield. And meanwhile, the Taliban were sitting back, okay, we figured out how you're going to do that. Now you're going to spend all your energy retraining people to take care of that one system, and they would set back, rearm, reset, find a new system, and put it on the battlefield. the discrepancy between the speed of their operation and the speed of our recognition, something that changes, got us in a lot of trouble. In our case, it took us almost a year to recognize something had changed, and then very rapidly we started delivering solutions to the battlefield. About 6 months. Here's kind of the challenge though. 16 months to recognize we had a problem, 12 more months to start delivering a solution. Our OODA loop, 28 months, flash to bang. The problem is the rest of the world was running about 8. They literally turned 3 loops inside the span of what it took us to turn 1. That was the cost. Almost 5,000 young men and women lost their lives, eyesight, severely train injured or otherwise traumatized, and the gap between those 38 months and our 28 months. And if I say nothing else in the time that I'm standing here, that is why we need your help. Because not everybody sees the same thing. It takes masses of people to sense early on that something has changed. It takes lots of ideas to sort through to find the right things. It takes the speed of an ability to build a network rapidly to solve something and then step back to wait for the next move. The concept of technological dominance is a farce. You can achieve it, but you can't keep it. And the real case is whether or not you can move fast enough to stay ahead of the bow wave of what other people are going to do to you. Our response was a massive pivot. I ran an organization that was embedded in theater that was supposed to see these things happen. And for 10 years, they'd done a great job of putting things on the battlefield. Unfortunately, they got really product-centric. They found things, low-hanging fruit, put it on the battlefield, celebrate the fact that it did something, but never really stuck around to find out whether they actually solved the problem or whether the problem they solved was really the problem they should have been focused on. And what they weren't doing were looking for the early signs that something was changing and found a new problem or a new set of problems to get back out to where they could find the right technologies to have on hand to very rapidly deploy against something. Our pivot. We recognized that first things, we weren't out at the edge of the battlefield anymore. Our folks were sitting on bases in Bagram and Kandahar rather than up in the mountains where the fights were at. We lacked the peripheral vision, and by peripheral vision it means the early signs that something is changing. In our business, that meant you have really good networks. I have lots of people who tell me things on a daily basis. I come to places like this because, quite frankly, you're a big network, and somebody in this room is going to tell me something important at some point, maybe years from now. But the network is huge and it's very responsive. We lacked an ability to understand the change in the environment that we were working in. We tended to be unilateral in implying something, but oftentimes we didn't realize that the problem we were looking at would change so fast that the technology it would take us a year to deploy would be obsolete the day it got there. It wasn't that it wasn't a problem, but it was a credit card problem, which means you find something, buy it, put it on the battlefield, and it's going to be useless in 6 months. So don't spend a lot of time developing it. We also realized that there were environmental problems that would be there as long as we had that mission that were worth, solve this one as fast as you can, but real quick, let's turn this into a program of record because it's going to keep changing, but it's worth to keep moving on. Finally, we lacked the partnerships that we needed to very rapidly cobble together things. And I was telling somebody earlier, this is a human-driven, personal network, trusted peer business. You can't automate it. It really takes humans in the loop doing hard things, making hard decisions about the things that move forward. And finally, we weren't aggressive enough. We got caught up in the loop of one problem, one solution, everything works, rather than quickly building lots of different MVPs that teach us about the problems, teach us about the problem space and the potential solutions. We just didn't have a big enough basket to pull from fast enough that will allow us to be responsive the way we should have been. And finally, as we realized, we had no pipeline for innovation. There was nothing that put all that together that allowed somebody like me to make decisions about the deployment of capital, human capital, which meant moving people around the battlefield to have conversations, and financial capital, which allowed us to buy things and pay for service to integrate things. So we built one. This is, let's say, the original Rapid Equipping Force innovation pipeline. It starts with recognizing how we sense things on the battlefield, and then how we fuse that and decided whether, do I know enough about this, or do I need to go back in and find out more? Who are the partners that I have that are going to tell me things? And then came down to the point of how do we define and tell a really good story about the thing we're trying to solve so that we can recruit people that don't think like us. Storytelling with a little bit of data became the most powerful thing we did, both internally to ourselves, with Congress, and in fact, even with the young men and women on the battlefield, who quite frankly would tell you, I'm trying to stay alive from one day to the next. I don't have time to figure out what my problem is. That's your job. And unfortunately, we knew that we needed to recruit them to cause. We needed to know what they knew. We needed them to talk to us. We had to sort out a way to mix government and industry and academia in the same place so we could explore the very rich connections between things and figure out how to build the best and brightest partnerships we could to actually get something done. And then finally, we needed a very rigorous system of taking ideas, learning from them quickly, killing off the things that weren't useful, taking what we learned from that, and eventually settling on what were the things we were going to put on the battlefield. We got pretty good at it. I did things like taking connexes, loading them full of their own power systems, CNC milling machines, 3D printers, 3D scanners, a scientist and an engineer and an infantryman, and dropping on the mountainsides in Afghanistan. And in my mind, I wanted people like that at the forward edge of the battlefield, catching young men and women right off the battle when the problems were fresh in their minds. And I wanted to snatch that stuff up and prototype it. We stopped building spec sheets and PowerPoint slides. I gave people Go programmers and says, just film that young man talking about what his issue is. And then see if you can't model it and get that data back to us. That's what we used on the battlefield. We curated our problems down to a high priority list, and we used those as our talking points to help recruit industry, academia, and other people to work for the cause. We ran things like this, where we put lots of people in one room, stood up on stage and said, here's my problem. Who's got something worth doing? And then we took them out to the middle of the desert and we applied things over and over again with a very diverse crowd because we were looking for the diverse responses. And then finally, we didn't just build one solution, we built lots of different variants. The one you see on the end is called Minotaur. It's a 3-foot wide robotic bobcat, first used in Fukushima to place radiological sensors that we added a mine roller to use for clearing IEDs on goat trails. The other one's a ground penetrating radar on the end of a stick. Same problem, different environment, different solution. Here are the results. 850 new problems, 520 of them curated and prioritized into something we wanted to work on. 360 different projects initiated in 18 months. 115 of them sent to the battlefield. 20 transitioned to program of record. And $1.5 billion invested by 120 people who worked out of double-wide trailers on a $100 million budget. A pipeline that includes people, a diverse crowd, recruits them to the cause, is the single best thing you can put to use to combat the speed of change on the battlefield. It starts on one end where people recognize something has changed and ends at the other end where you have the right partnerships that allow you to employ capital to make things change. Today, that pipeline looks a lot different, but not really. What we've learned is that the discipline, the data help us create stories that draw people to us. Our ability to connect them around a common language and a common framework for innovation allows us to make decisions about the deployment and use of capital. First and foremost, the human capital that nobody keeps track of, the time and the energy that people have to spend in a room together that allows us to get to the point where we can ask for dollar capital to actually pay for things. 5 steps to the innovation pipeline, starting with how you source things. And I call this sensing and exploring. Idea scale that you're using right now is a great sensing mechanism. Generate lots of ideas and pull them out. But the step that follows that is how do you explore the very unique connections between different ideas. An idea that came out of Vandenberg that was similar to an idea but not the same that came out of here versus one at Beale versus one at McDill, quite frankly, when looked at separately might not be a big deal. But when you look at the trend between all of them and you start seeing the very unique connections between the technologies, it really is. The ability to spend time in a room with really bright people and diverse crowds to explore those unique connections helps you build a bench of things that you can then draw from and decide whether or not they're worth moving. The process of curating, whether it's a problem, boiling it down to make sure that we're not inserting our pipeline full of things that don't matter, but we're actually curating the best and brightest, biggest potential investments we can make with our time, is a bit art, it's a bit science, but it's a lot of data. There's a lot of time crunching things with people, trying to bring those problems together and say, I've got 50 problems that are 70% the same. To me, that's one big problem that's worth investing in. And it's a challenge for us. Coming out of curation is, how do we take the things that we curated that are truly important to us and prioritize, and then discover first that we got the problem right, second, that we can actually come up with a solution, third, that we can actually build a bench of people who can deliver the solution, and fourth, can we build a pathway by which that team can actually get that thing to transition to the next step. It's really scientific method. It's what we teach in a college classroom, it's what we teach at the enterprise level. The art of discovery, of coming up with a thesis about something, developing an MVP, and coming up with a set of tests and interviewing a boatload of people to gather data is what lets you make hard decisions about what you kill off and what moves. Silicon Valley, great place, full of great ideas, is exceptionally efficient at coming up with 1,000 ideas and then very rapidly killing off 999 of them. And taking the lessons from the deaths of the 900 to back up the reason that they invested in the one thing. It's not that complicated. Same thing, incubating things is taking disparate teams and these groups and ecosystems are wrapped around something, and then figuring out first is, can we decide that we agree on the technology readiness level of what we're looking at, relevant to the environment, relevant to the problem we're solving. Then, can I look at the team that I'm asking to deliver something? And in the case of companies, is the right founders, the right IP, the right business plan? Do they have the right investors? Do they understand the government issues that they have to get by? Can they do contracting? Can they do finance? Quite frankly, can they build a business that will scale to deliver what we have to? Are they actually investable? And then finally, there's an adoption readiness level that says, have I identified the government entity or the commercial entities that will actually buy this thing? And build a pathway by which not only just to get the first one bought, but I get the second, the third, and the 1 millionth. All part of an investment strategy that actually says this is worthy of scaling and initially of turning into much bigger. And finally, the last step, the one that bedevils everybody, is transition. And it's not always transition to program or record. You know, the earlier slide where you said 115 things put into theater and 20 transition to program or record. You know, there's still 15 things there. 10 years later, we are still flying trailer-borne aerostats with sensor systems in Afghanistan that the Rapid Equipping Force is still sustaining. Never moved to a program or record. Still a critical entity in theater, but still out there. The transition isn't always moved to a program or record. Sometimes it's just trying to get to a state where you're still allowed to get things from it and put it to good use. So I appreciate the time. That's my story. That's the reason I think that all of you are here, and it is certainly the reason that I wanted to come down and talk to all of you. So thanks for what you do.